nitahesabika, nitasimama, nitachukua hatua, nitahesabika.
Good morning once again. It is a joy to be here in your company. I must rush to express my gratitude to Dr. Watanga for such a gracious introduction. I will be 35 next month. So I came in early. I want to thank the Hesabika Trust and Tear Fund and all of those who have been part of organizing this morning's breakfast and for inviting me to return to your wonderful city here in Nairobi to talk about leading change and to talk about the work of faith-based cultural transformation. As I listened to your introductions going around the room, I was in awe listening to those of you who are leading corporations and entrepreneurs and doctors and lawyers and bishops and students and just people who are trying to do the right things the right way. And I asked myself, why am I here talking to you? But I recognized that what brought me here is purpose. And what we have before us to discuss today is purpose. Not so much what we do, but why it matters. And that is really what is at the heart of leading change. At maybe a decade or two, maybe even a few generations ago, what we thought about in terms of leadership was that the person who had the responsibility of leading was the person who had the biggest title. And so we thought about trying to aspire to big titles of responsibility as what would give us the right to lead. But now what we're seeing, especially with younger people, is that they don't care about your title, they care about whether you are trustworthy. Right? And what we're finding is that globally, there is less trust in people with titles. There is less trust in people who are in political leadership. There is less trust of people who are even clergy, not because they're bad people, but because others have done things that have caused us to lose trust in leadership. Which means then, as leaders, our responsibility is not to wave our titles in the air and get people to comply with our demands, but the opportunity that we have in front of us is to influence people, to build trust and to gain respect so that we don't have to force change, but we can invite people into change and they will stay with us. This is so important because the work of leading organizational change is hard work. Whether you have a startup or whether you have a decades-old institution, leading organizational change is incredibly difficult work. I think about the philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli, who said that there is nothing more dangerous to conduct, nor more doubtful in its success, than to set up as a leader in the introduction of changes. Because whoever innovates has for their enemies all those who are well off under the existing order of things, and only the lukewarm support of those who might be better off under the new order of things. In other words, what Machiavelli is trying to help us understand is that when you're trying to lead change, you're going to have resistance. You're going to have people who don't like it. Now, we understand that there may be people who don't like change when they would be better off if we left them alone. We understand that. But what may be hard for us to understand is that we will also get resistance from people whose lives will be better off if we're actually successful. That may be hard to believe. But the reality is some of us are so fearful that we'd rather stay in situations that we hate than look toward the future and embrace a situation that might be better but is unknown. Some of us are so fearful that we would rather stay bound. We'd rather stay in bondage than explore the unknown of freedom. And so it's this psychology that has to influence how we lead change. It's this idea called loss aversion. Loss aversion simply says that losses hurt us more deeply than equivalent gains feel good. If I gave each of you this morning 1 million shillings, how happy would you be? Very happy. If you lost 1 million shillings this morning, how devastated would you be? You'd be more devastated in losing the million than you would be happy in gaining the million. You would be more motivated to act to avoid the loss of 1 million than you would be motivated to earn 1 million. That is the idea of loss aversion. And so what happens is that people get fearful about what they stand to lose instead of having hope about the idea of what they stand to gain. So leading change is hard work, and it cannot be done as an individual. It must involve collective effort. It must involve collaboration carefully with other people who are coming together with a sense of common purpose. It involves building a team first, building those who have interest in what you're trying to do. You don't try to go convince people to change who are sworn enemies first. You go after people who are on your side, and you strengthen your base. So if you're trying to lead a change in an organization or trying to establish a new policy, you've got to find the people who are already in agreement, not the people you have to convince. You'll get to them later. You have to first find the people who are like-minded. And I believe that this is exactly what Hesabika and Tear Fund have done this morning in convening a group of people that is like-minded in terms of understanding what's at stake. This is not simply about organizational effectiveness. This is not simply about refining your strategy. This is about the soul of a nation. This is about the future of generations yet to be born. This is about saying to our children's children that we don't want them to have to fight the giants that we could have fought and beat in our own day. So many people are familiar with the story of David and Goliath. But those of you all who have gone to Sunday school a couple of years might recognize the fact that Goliath should never have been alive for David to fight. If the children of Israel had done as God commanded them, the Philistines would have never been alive long enough for Goliath to be born. But because they did not do exactly what God called them to do, they left some work undone, which left Goliath as an enemy to the people of God. And David had to fight a fight that his forefathers should have made not even necessary. So the question we have before us today is, are we willing to fight the giants of our generation, or are we going to pass them to our children's children with apologies for our lack of courage? This is the work of leading change. It requires vision. It requires courage. It requires clarity. And it requires a commitment to what is called vocation. Vocation, you all, is often used in terms of ministry. So those of us who are clergy, we understand the idea of vocation, that there is a calling from God to do a work for the Lord. And many of us think that vocation is only about clergy and pastoral ministry. But the word vocation does not limit God to only calling people to preach the gospel. God is calling people to stand up as lawyers. God is calling people to stand up as physicians. God is calling people to stand up as bankers. God is calling people to stand up in the work of international development. God is calling people to stand up in the education sector. God is calling people to stand up in science. God is calling people to stand up in architecture and in engineering and in marketing and in human resources and in all the spaces that you occupy. If we believe that God is able to call people to ministry, we can't limit ministry to what happens on Sunday mornings in pulpits. Ministry is happening outside the walls of churches, and ministry is what's happening in the marketplace. Which means then that as leaders in the marketplace, we have not only an opportunity, but a responsibility to set up our organizations as places of ministry and transformation. Which means then that we have a completely different mindset about what we're doing. It's not just about trying to earn shillings and sell products and services. What we're doing is ministry. And as I have observed, sometimes the ministries that we're called to are not to our customers or to our clients or to our parishioners. Sometimes the ministry that is most meaningful is the ministry we have to the people who are working alongside of us. Sometimes God is calling us to be present with someone in their difficulty and in their grief and in their distress because we work with them every day. God is calling us, each and every one of us, to look at our work as sacred. God is calling each and every one of us to answer the question, am I doing with my life what I have been called to do? Now, this does not mean that you have to go become a preacher. That is not what I'm suggesting. What I am saying is that you only have one life to live. And many of us spend so much of our lives doing things that don't really matter. Doing things that other people think are successful. We figure out how to climb the ladder of success, and then we get to the top of the ladder and we recognize we climbed the wrong ladder. What do you do when you have been successful, but you have been a fraud because you have not done what God called you to do? What do you do when you find yourself being applauded by other people, but knowing on the inside that you have failed yourself, and you have failed your God, and you have failed your country? Because the very vision that you had on the inside of you, you aborted. This is the work of leadership. And leadership is all about change. If you are not leading change, you're not leading. If you're not leading change, you're just babysitting. Because the work of change is not just about transforming organizations, it's also the work of transforming people. And if you're not pushing people to be better than they were yesterday and making them uncomfortable, you're not really leading. You're just in a popularity contest, hoping that you'll get good ratings and be liked. But being liked is not being a leader. Sometimes leadership causes us to do the unpopular thing. Sometimes leadership causes us to stand with clear conviction and do what may seem potentially dangerous. But you know that your life won't be fulfilled unless you do it, unless you stand up and be counted. And so the work of organizational change that I would like to talk to us about is thinking about how we set up our organizations as places of ministry. Not necessarily having worship services after work. That's not what I'm saying. Because those of us who are pastors know that even if we have a worship service every single night of the week, and let's say you have church for a really long time, like 3 hours every time, that's only 21 hours of worship, which means that most of us in the room spend more time at work than we do in worship, which means we have to change our thinking to recognize that worship is not just what we do when we lift our hands and sing songs. Worship is what we do when we glorify God every day. So how can we set up our organizations as places of ministry and places of purpose? This is really about how we transform culture. It is a significant shift to think about your work as an accountant as ministry unto the Lord. It might be a significant shift for you to think about being a professor as ministry unto the Lord. Maybe it's not for some of you, but for some of us, I imagine it might be, because the stakes become a whole lot higher. I recognize that as a professor and as a pastor, that I cannot leave my soul in the parking lot when I go to teach. And I recognize that as a pastor, I can't leave my brain in the parking lot when I go to preach. I have to bring all of me wherever I go, which means that we have to start encouraging people to not leave their faith in the parking lot, to leave their faith outside. My question to us is, are people able to live their faith in your workplace freely? Or are they living their faith in the workplace in spite of your leadership? Some of us are living our faith at work despite the difficulty we face from our leaders. And the truth is, if it hadn't been for our faith, we would have done some crazy stuff. But I would encourage us to think about how we set up our organizations as places of discipleship. How can I, as a leader, encourage the spiritual development of my people just as I encourage their professional development? How can I encourage them to do better work while I also encourage them to be better men and women? This is the work. This is the work of cultural transformation. Organizational cultures are built on 3 critical foundations. Number 1 is purpose. Purpose is everything. Purpose is not what we do, it's why it matters. So I heard earlier that there was someone here from Kenya Airways. And some of us have flown Kenya Airways, some of us have flown British Airways, and a number of other airlines. And the truth is, they all fly planes. They're all in the same business. So what differentiates one airline from another is not what business they're in. They are parking planes in airports, loading people on, going in the air, going from point A to point B. It's the same activity. What differentiates one from the other is the culture. It's the purpose that they have that animates why they're doing what they're doing. Purpose is critical, and it's something that we must wrestle with as individuals so that then we can also help our organizations be clear on what they have been called to do. In the nonprofit sector, this is a significant issue because a lot of nonprofit organizations start doing things that are not theirs to do. It's called mission creep. You'll start a school, and then you recognize that the kids are hungry, so then you start a food pantry. And then you recognize that some of the kids don't have a stable home, so then you also start a dormitory and a homeless shelter for their parents. And then you recognize the parents don't have jobs, and so you start a career center, but you're in elementary school. You don't have to do all good things by yourself. You have to know what you were called and created to do and do that. So this question of purpose is critical. Much of the bad behavior that we see in organizations, corruption and mistreatment of people, cannot be corrected by policies and practices, because policies aim to change people's behavior, but purpose is about minds and hearts. And if you can change someone's mind, you can change their behavior. That is the work of the Holy Spirit. You can't transform anybody absent the power of God. So purpose is the critical foundation. On top of purpose, the second critical foundation is principles. These are values that guide how we do what we do. These values have to be lived out. It's not good enough for these values to be on the website, or for these principles to be in some kind of sign on the wall in your organization, or for people to recite them every day. These principles have to be part of the bedrock of how you execute your strategy. And when there are principles, then there has to be accountability. Principles then bring accountability. This is where integrity comes into play, my friends. Integrity is not about whether you agree with my particular moral code. Integrity is about, do you actually live out the values that you say you uphold? And so then what we should be able to see is that your values drive the behavior in the organization. I'm not willing to just make money no matter what. There are some lines I won't cross. Why? Because I have principles. And then what we do is then we attract people into our organizations who have those same principles. You don't wait until you have already hired somebody to then screen for their principles. If I'm running a bank and integrity is important, yes, I understand that there are moments where you need to fill a position quickly, but I promise you it would be better to leave that position vacant for a few more weeks than to hire the wrong person and wish you never met him. It requires clarity and conviction to make sure that we are screening for principles, so that the cultures that we build are healthy and strong, and that the people that we promote also embody those principles. I can't run the bank, have integrity as a value, and then promote the guy who just stole 5 million shillings on camera. Then I'll come to you and say integrity is important, and you'll laugh in my face. Or maybe you'll be very polite and you'll laugh behind my back. But the reality is principles help build healthy cultures. And then the final critical piece are practices. Purpose, principles, practices. These are the habits that the organization has. These are the routines, the disciplines that the organization has. These are the daily rituals that the organization carries out, which means that we cannot change a culture by just changing our practices. We change a culture by changing our purpose. It means seeing our work through God's eyes. Think about for just a moment all the things you've been through. You wonder why you survived to this point. You've survived things that have killed other people. You have survived things that have taken other people out. God has left you here with clear purpose. Can you see the reason why you've been spared from God's perspective? And if we can, we'll recognize that we have been positioned in the places of influence that we have been positioned in. Whether you are in entertainment or in education or in law or in medicine or in finance or in marketing or in human resources or in government, wherever you may find yourself, you recognize that you've been planted there by God. And when you get there and you're clear on your purpose, you recognize that you have discovered the work you can't not do. It would be easier for me to say in English, you've discovered the work that you must do. But that's not strong enough. It's the work that you can't not do. It's the work that if your hands were tied behind your back and you couldn't do it anymore, you'd be shaking and unsatisfied because you know your very life depends on making a difference. That's the work of organizational change. It's bigger than just a new IT system or a new HR policy. It's reimagining the soul of the organization. It's reimagining who we are and why we're here and what we ought to do about it. So my understanding is that we have some time for questions. Is that right? But thank you all very much.
Please join me in giving another very warm round of applause to our speaker. What we're going to do, we're shortly going to go into a panel discussion, which will have some panelists who've been doing various forms of change activity and innovation here in Kenya. So to try and contextualize what Dr. Pearce has just shared, to try and see if there are local examples and local applications of the principles that he's applied. But before we do that, I think it would be good for us, while this thing is still hot and fresh, just to have a few questions. So I'll just allow 2 or 3 questions, maybe just one round, because there'll be another opportunity for us to get back to this. So if there's a roving microphone, I will just do one round, and just keep your questions short and precise, and then Dr. Pearce will respond to those.
Hello, again, my name is Gibbs, Program Manager at Della. My question is, what do you recommend should be the mindset, the approach of an individual when you're leading change, but you're not the key leader? Yes.
Sure. Leading from the second chair is very difficult. A lot of us think that leadership is about titles and formal authority, and that certainly is true to an extent. But leadership is more about behaviors than it is about positions and titles, which means that leadership can be demonstrated by anyone in the organization. It is difficult to lead change in an organization where your principles are not aligned with the key leaders, right? And that is where you oftentimes run into difficulty. We can disagree about how to get there, but as long as we're aligned on the vision and the purpose of why we exist, we shouldn't have much difficulty. The difficulty comes in when we don't agree on purpose and principles. And so you have a difficult decision to make. If you are in an organization where you're working for people who are causing your soul to die every day, people who are minimizing you and sub-optimizing you, you have to ask, have I been called to this particular place? And am I called to stay? And sometimes the answer is yes, because you're called to be an agent of transformation. And sometimes that means you just have to give them the gift of goodbye, because your well-being is more important. And you're not willing to die and have a heart attack and have a stroke working for someone who's trying to take your life by keeping you in a box. Right? So there is a degree of sensitivity to that. Sometimes you're called to stay, and God will give you the strength and the grace to do it. And sometimes you find yourself in those difficult positions because it's building your character. But there are other moments where God is saying, okay, time to go. I am making it so uncomfortable for you that by staying longer, you're harming yourself. And so you have to be able to hear clearly about why you're there and not overstaying your calling. And knowing just as it was time for you to come, there may be a time for you to go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearce. We appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
A quick one, probably quick and short. What is this one thing that the Christian in the marketplace must not do because he's a Christian?
The one thing that a Christian must not do, anything that dishonors God. Anything that dishonors God is what we can't do. We've been called into the various spheres of influence that we've been called into. Nobody is suggesting that everyone needs to become a pastor to honor God. You can be an accountant and do the math well and honor God. You can be a physician and make sure that people have access to quality health care no matter their income level, and that honors God. You don't give good care to rich people and poor care to poor people. Like, those things can honor God. Where we have to be very clear is what lines we cannot cross, because in trying to advance Christ's kingdom, God will never call us to do things that don't please the Lord. That means different things in different sectors. So it's literally a daily commitment to give your day to the Lord. When my wife and I wake up every morning, we pray that God would give us wisdom, would give us sound judgment, and would make us a blessing to people. I work as a professor. My wife works as a structural engineer. She designs buildings. So we are not in church all day long, where you might think it's easy to honor God in church, although pastors know that sometimes some not very honorable things can happen in church. But the reality is, every day and every decision we're surrendering to the Lord. Every interaction, because we don't know who God would have us to bless. And so the thing that the Christian can't do or must not do is disconnect from the leading of the Holy Spirit, so that whatever it is they're doing and wherever it is they're going, God is using them. That makes it ministry. It's not ministry because we call it ministry. It's ministry because if God doesn't empower it, it won't work.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. You started by quoting Niccolo Machiavelli. So how do you reconcile between being a Christian and being a Machiavellian, especially when you aspire to leadership, you aspire to cause change, but in that process, you have to be Machiavellian. And as we all know, being Machiavellian means it's the opposite of being Christian, but it could be essential in wanting to be a leader. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I would not suggest that you need to be Machiavellian in your approach to leadership. What I am simply suggesting by quoting Machiavelli is that he had some wisdom about the difficulty of leading change. It's important that we not throw people completely away whose values may not be completely aligned with ours. If we were to discard people just because of their worst moments, we would never read the book of Psalms, because David was an adulterer. Bless you. And how could you draw inspiration and encouragement from an adulterer? Because that doesn't honor God. Nobody's saying that the adultery is okay. What we're saying is that, thank the Lord, we are not defined by our lowest moments, but that even in the midst of difficulty and even sometimes our own sin, God can still bless us to be used to be a blessing in some way. So I'm not suggesting that we become Machiavellian and power hungry in our leadership. All I was doing was simply suggesting that contrary to what many of us think, we're going to encounter resistance in leading change, even when we're trying to help people to be better. They will sometimes resist because they're afraid. But I would never suggest that as Christians, we aspire to lead in manipulative and divisive and disintegrous ways. I would argue that all power in heaven and earth belongs to the Lord. And any leadership that we have is just delegated power, which means then that whether we get caught for our bad deeds or not, we are all accountable to the one who gave us the power in the first place, right? And that means it's not just about the good or the outcomes that you're able to create, it's also about the process you take to get there. And some of us think that God is willing to excuse sloppy processes just for the sake of good outcomes. And I believe God is not just calling us to do good, God is calling us to be good as we do good.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I think let's leave it there for now. There'll be another opportunity to interact with Dr. Pearce. And I would like to invite our panelists to come down. Dr. Pearce, you can take your seat. Around the applause, please.